When you don't have 20 minutes to watch a full review, when you're not looking for a how to play or an hour-long playthrough, and let's be honest, when the interest is a little lower too, that's why we have 6 small box games for you. Hey, I'm Alex Rackle from Board Game Co., and this is going to be another 6 small box game review, possibly the lowest average rating that we've had on any reviews ever on the channel. Any of these roundup things, I usually put in the more mediocre games, at least mediocre for me, into these roundup reviews, and I think this is the worst average ratings we've had so far. And I'm going to go ahead and cover these in order of least to most favorite. There is at least one game amongst these that I think is actually pretty decent, and I don't think is bad at all, and the rest of the other 5 I kind of don't think are that great. You can go ahead and check out the timestamps if you just want to go ahead and just see the order, because again, I will be ranking these in order. But starting off with, let's go ahead and start off with this one over here. This is Come On Bite Me, and this is going to be a 2 out of 5. I'm starting off just aggressive on this one. This is a 2 out of 5. The basic idea of the game is you're going to be drawing cards, and then every round you're drawing cards and then choosing to either attack other players or gang up with other players or pulling into retreat. You're trying to choose how to act based on the animal that you've drawn. It doesn't feel like there's a lot going on here as far as the actual gameplay and strategy, and so I don't know, maybe there is. Maybe this is a great game, maybe I'm missing the nuance of how to play things or how to gang up with other players, but it ultimately feels like a lot of blind guessing, because you're also, you're not seeing what other cards are, what other players have, and so you're just kind of blind guessing based on numbers and based on a minor amount of abilities. It just wasn't a very fun experience. There might be nuance here, but if there is, it's nuance that I'm not seeing. From there, we're going to go ahead and jump to our next 2 out of 5. Yes, we do have two out of 5s over here. Let's go ahead with Althingi. Althingi over here is unfortunately another 2 out of 5, and it's a shame because I was actually kind of excited for this one. The general premise of Althingi is that you are bidding on, well, you're starting with loot cards. Every player is going to have a certain region that they have in the game, and you're going to have hands of loot cards you're drawing every round, and you have your own asymmetric ability as well as far as when and how you draw extra loot cards or things like that. But then you're going to have these Vikings that you're bidding on, trying to acquire these Vikings to your gang effectively. You're trying to gather them to yourself, and so you're going to be secretly bidding loot cards and then revealing them based on what, the value of the loot card itself, based on the Vikings' preferences, and then gathering those Vikings. From there, you're going to go into a round of facing off. Once you have all these Vikings, you're going to start facing off against other players, utilizing the Vikings and buffing them again with loot cards in order to go ahead and then, eventually try to win all these battles, and at the end of the game, be the player with the most Vikings. You're going to add up the strength on your Vikings that survived, add up less strength on the Vikings that died, and whoever, has the most Viking strength is going to be the Althingi. The reason this got bumped down from a 2.5 to a 2, the rulebook's terrible. The rulebook is very non-intuitive to understand, and I still think that there's sections of text missing, otherwise the game doesn't make sense to me at all. There's sections of, transitional setup that are just, assume that you'll figure it out, which, I did, to be fair, so they're not wrong, but I did have to, read 4 times back and forth, making sure I understood it. So the rulebook was a bit of a mess trying to actually get up and understand how to play the game. Not the most intuitive, not the best rulebook. And the gameplay from there just feels like draw cards, play cards, draw cards, play cards. Didn't feel like there was a ton of meaningful decision as far as, how to vie for certain Vikings or gather or equip certain Vikings. Kind of feels like, hey, you have these cards, they'll have certain values, you'll use those cards, you'll bid with those cards. There was no hook to the gameplay system. Contrast that with a game like For Sale. This kind of had a similar arc to a game like For Sale, where you have 2 different phases of how you're operating within the system. In For Sale, you're going to be buying houses and selling houses. In Althingi, you're using the loot cards to go ahead and gather the Vikings, and you're using the Vikings to win battles, once again referencing the loot cards. It's a very similar arc, but For Sale has a hook to how it operates that makes it an enjoyable puzzle of how to think or outthink your opponents, and Althingi just didn't have that. So for me, not that enjoyable of an experience, unfortunately. From there, let's go ahead and dive into our 2.5s, because we have a few 2.5s here. And I guess I'll go ahead and start off with Art Robbery at a 2.5 over here. Art Robbery is coming from Helvetic Games, designed by Rainer Knizia. This is a game which across 4 rounds of play, you're going to be divvying up the loot from various, thefts or robberies or whatnot. You have these tokens that go into the middle of the table, and you're basically going to be, let's see if we can show you over here. You have different tokens over here that will go into the middle of the table, and you're going to be playing cards from your hand for the values to gather those tokens. So for example, if I play a 3, I'll take a 3 from the middle of the table. And there's a limited number of 3s in the middle in this round that we're gathering and divvying up the loot. The problem from there is that once there are no more 3s in the middle of the table, that's when somebody who plays a 3 will instead take the card from somebody else instead. And the round ends when there are no more loot tokens in the middle of the table. So you're going back and forth in this kind of puzzle of trying to gather things, but stealing from others when it's not available. And then there's also a guard dog. So you can go ahead and try to get the guard dog to protect your own loot in order to stop it from, being stolen when somebody else comes around. Which is all fine, but the core game just kind of, to me, just devolved into draw a card, play a card, draw. Well, technically it's play a card, draw a card. Play a card, draw a card, play a card, draw a card, play a card, draw a card. It just wasn't, I didn't feel there was any thing that interesting going on, I guess. I mean, like, the biggest thing that have that's interesting is there are certain alibi points on the tokens, and whoever has the most alibi points, whoever has the least alibi points, is going to go ahead and just not win, or in a two-player game, give up some points instead. And that's a very similar mechanism to a High Society that Renner Knizia has as well. High Society, at least, was an interesting, nuanced game as far as the operations you proceeded in, and for Art Robbery, again, like, similar to Come On Bite Me, maybe there's some strong level of nuance as far as how you play things and the mind think and all that, but I just didn't see that at play in this game. For me, Art Robbery, it's a 2.5 out of 5. It's not a game I particularly will be diving into that eagerly. Then we also have over here Stool Pigeon as another 2.5 out of 5. Stool Pigeon over here, this one is a game from Barrel Age Games, and this one, to be fair to this one, this has a degree of entertainment that might make this a game that's better for you, meaning it's always hard. It's always hard giving it a subjective rating, but then trying to be objective as to how it relates to others, which is an interesting conversation in its own right. My ratings are always subjective to me. Sometimes I believe a game is more objectively bad, which is still a subjective opinion about the objective relevance of it. It's a whole conversation for another day. The reason that's relevant to Stool Pigeon is Stool Pigeon for me is a 2.5, and I'll give into specific reasons how the game plays, why it's not as much for me. But I do think there's a degree of fun behind this one that might make it a better game for those looking for a lighter, simpler, accessible experience that has a degree of humor to it. And in Stool Pigeon, you're basically going to have 4 cards in front of you. You're going to have 4 cards in front of you that in specific rows, two by two in front of you. All players will have that. You're going to look at some of your cards and try to memorize what those cards are. But then from there, every turn you're going to be drawing a card and then replacing with one of your cards. And the card you replace goes into the center, at which point players are desperately trying to get rid of their cards, or your cards for that matter, by matching that number. So you might accidentally, intentionally or accidentally, you might reveal a 10 to the center. And then suddenly players are trying to immediately play any 10s they have to try to match that card. And if they play it from your cards, they'll give you one of their own cards. If they play it from their cards, they're down a card. The reason that's relevant is because then the game, the person who wins is the person who has the lowest value of their cards. So you're trying to both get rid of cards and also replace cards away. So, if I know that one of my cards is a 7 and I draw a 4, I might replace that 4 to the 7 or go for the ones I don't know, hoping it plays out. And that gives me a bit of an edge because I know it's coming. So there's a degree of planning, but much more so a degree of chaos as players desperately try to play cards, hoping that they're right. Sometimes you'll be wrong and play the wrong thing, and that's a penalty. You'll have to draw another card and deal with that. So for me, this one, I think ultimately, and then also the mechanism, you can always call the end of the game if you think you have the lowest total, which has an interesting loophole in this, in the sense that you can theoretically, from my understanding of the rules at least, you can call that at any point in the game. So if I start off with a 1 or a 2 as the cards that I know that I have, and then I draw a 3 and put it down, I can immediately call for the end game, and I'm likely going to win. Players will all have one chance to resolve or address that. Now, granted, that does mean you have to have good cards to begin with, but it does mean that a good hand means there's a reasonable chance you can just start the game by saying, I'm going to win. I'm going to win, and then see if players can beat you or not. It's actually comparable to, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on it. Scram. It's similar to Scram in that sense, except Scram had a mechanism that stops you from being able to do that call early on in the game. And I think ultimately this also does compare to Scram to a large degree. I think Stool Pigeon to me feels very similar to Scram. Scram feels like a better version of the same system. Both of them are more fun than the pure gameplay would give me, I guess, if that makes sense. It's hard to really gauge, but I think Scram to me is a very light game that I enjoy far more than I should, and it's still here despite being as light as it possibly could be. That's a game that if you read the rules, at least for me, I read the rules, I was like, I will not like this game. And I think I did like it, and a big part of why I think I did like Scram is the sense of teammateness, the teamwork behind the game, because you're working with a teammate in the game, or multiple teammates. And so I like that sense of how Scram operated, and some other small rules differences that made it just a overall better system while still being very rules light and party adjacent. Stool Pigeon kind of feels like it's trying to do the same thing, but for me, it didn't have that sense of teamwork. It had that little loophole of being able to call early on, and ultimately I think for me, this one, like I debated whether to call this one a 3. Honestly, Scram itself may have prevented me from calling this one a 3, because when it's lighter than what I'd like, there is a degree of humor and entertainment behind it, but ultimately it still fell short for me. So that's going to be Stool Pigeon over here, a 3 out of 5. 2.5 out of 5. Then from there we have our 3 out of 5, which is going to be Tricky Goblins. Tricky Goblins is a trick-taking game that I actually picked up at a Level Up Retreat. Someone saw me playing this and was kind enough to offer a review copy to cover, and I think Tricky Goblins has a bunch of good ideas behind it. This one I wanted to rate a little higher, but I'm not going to. It's a 3 out of 5 for me, and the reason for that is, in Tricky Goblins, it is a trick-taking game, but the hook of it is that one of the things you're trying to do is, as you play cards, you're adding dice into the center and rotating those dice to match the cards card you play. So if you play a 5 purple, you put a 5 purple in the center. But then from there, you have your own personal goals of how many types of dice you're trying to add in order to get point rewards. So maybe I want to get 3 5s, in which case I'll suddenly go ahead and get, I'll get a point, a gold coin for doing so. So you're not just playing the trick-taking game, but you're also playing a separate side game of trying to manage the dice in the middle. And then from there, the players who lose the trick have the opportunity to manipulate the middle a little bit more, and that progresses. It plays across 3 rounds, and that ability to manipulate the middle gets a little easier as you go through it. And so that core concept, everything I said there, kind of works in an interesting way to an extent, to a point that does make it a game that I was kind of more inclined to bump it to a 3.5. The reason it's down to a 3 for me is a few small things. The first is that the game starts off much slower than I'd like. The amount of time it takes to get a few dice into the middle that reasonably fulfill your goals is just a slower ramp up than I would personally want out of the system. I wish they had started out of the gate a little stronger, a little faster. I think it could have been a better game if they had the same system, but just a few more stuff going on. It gives you less agency over how you control things, so I understand why they did it the way they did it, but ultimately it means that the game takes a little bit of time to get to the part where I feel like I'm really enjoying the tempo more so than any other trick-taking game. Past that, the other issue is going to be rules again. I thought the rules were definitely not great, a little unnecessarily complicated. There's a whole like tankard card. It's not even called a tankard. There's a basically grog. I think it's called the grog card, where you're basically going to play that and that has an impact or an ability on the game. But that whole system is so unnecessarily convoluted that it doesn't add enough to the game system, in my opinion, obviously in my opinion, and it's unnecessarily convoluted as far as the rules, as far as the understanding, so there are a few issues that kind of held it back from being a 3.5 for me, but that's going to be Tricky Goblins. Which brings us lastly to Fika. Fika, a game that is not the best game, not by any means, but honestly I enjoy Fika enough that I felt bad putting it in this video, and I debated whether I shouldn't, but I did, because I do these small box game reviews, and they're not strictly speaking based on ratings, they just generally have a lower rating behind them. But Fika, from 20th Century Games, this is a 3.5. I enjoy Fika. There's a fun little puzzle going on, an interplay over here. This is one which basically you're going to have, I think it's 18 cards, there's a 1 to 6 and 3 suits, that's 18 cards in play, and you're going to have hand of, again, I think 6 of them. You're going to have 6 to yourself, 4 off to a sideboard, and then 2 off to a separate sideboard where they'll have an influence on the center board. We're getting into technicalities here. But the basic idea is every card that you play has 2 things. It has an ability, and it also has a way that it scores. And those are different things. And you're going to be playing 5 of these 6 cards onto your board. You have a row of 5 cards, they have a row of 5 cards, and they all have different ways of scoring. So for instance, one card might score based on having 3 suits of the same type next to each other. Another card might score if you have a 1 and 6 on the opposite ends. So that all sounds well and good. It's just a little puzzle of trying to optimize around, hey, how can I manage this hand of cards to get as many points as possible? The thing that both makes it better and worse at the same time is the amount of messing around with others that goes on in the game. Because the ability part of the card will give you something you can do as far as an ability. The ability might be swap this card with a sideboard card, so you can have that. That's fun, that's useful. But it might also be swap 2 of the other players, well, not 2 other players, swap from the other player, swap 2 of their cards. Well, technically it says either player, but very often that will be the other player, because you're already playing your cards into your own patterns that you want, although your opponent will mess with you, so holding on to those cards for later is part of the puzzle. But you're trying to figure out when do you want to utilize abilities that will help you and or hurt your opponent in the most damaging way at the most opportune time. Saving everything for later is great. The problem is you always have to play a card, so you can't save everything for later. One of the cards you play will be your 5th card, and you kind of want all of your cards to be your 5th card, but you just can't have that happen. And so trying to figure out that little puzzle as far as the back and forth as you play cards, trying to outscore your opponent across 3 rounds of play, best of 2 and all that. But that's basically going to be how Fika plays. I enjoy the puzzle. I enjoy the puzzle, and let's I don't know if I can show you over here. We'll show you the cards over here, but you basically have, it's not really the way it works over here. You have the center row, you have the cards over here, you have the other side as well. But basically, in Fika over here, I enjoy the puzzle. I think the only thing that holds it back a little bit for me, and again, still a 3.5 out of 5, is the level of screwage, the level of messing with others in this game is so high to the point that a big part of the game is play cards so that you could not do the thing that your opponent's going to stop you from doing. To a certain extent, the best way to play this game is to assume you'll be best with, and then tempt your opponent into messing with you in a way that doesn't actually mess with you, but if you kind of hint to the idea that you're going for 3 suits in a row, they'll screw that up, they'll mess you over, but then that actually is not what you're going for. Maybe instead you were going for just having the 1 and the 6, and you were kind of going for a degree of subterfuge as far as how you operate. So kind of tempting your opponent into misplaying their attacks on you, I find is the best way to play, because otherwise the game kind of comes down to the first half. you're just not able to get as much done because you're going to be messed with. And the second half, it's a question of who can squeeze in those extra points. The other thing that kind of holds it back is the nature of some of these center scoring cards. Again, you have to know the system, but there's an opportunity to kind of double or triple scores in the middle. The difference that has is so impactful that if you can like triple a 9-point scoring card, that might be 80% of your points in the whole round. So sometimes the entire round can come down to a single play as opposed to the entire thing you're doing. So I both like it. I do enjoy this one. This is on BGA, and I can see myself diving into it there more, but I think that in the vein of many of these games, this one does a little bit too much in the screwage department with a little less ways to manage or mitigate, that it's held back just a drop for me. And so that's what we have over here. Going over these once again, we have a 2 over here from Come On Bite Me, a 2 for Althingi, a 2.5 for Robbery, a 2.5 for Stool Pigeon, a 3 for Tricky Goblins, and a 3.5 for Fika. That today has been your 6 small box game reviews. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.